Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I request all of you to please make sure that your cell phones are switched off. And even if you receive a call, please don't accept it and begin a conversation while the session is on. I request all of you to make sure that there's no flash photography while the session is on. Our session now is The Hired Man. We have Aminatta, Forna, and introduced by Anita, Anand. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to what's going to be, I know, a really exciting session because not only do we get the privilege of meeting an outstanding author in the English language, but I can honestly say one of the nicest people I've met at the Jaipur Literary Festival, one of the most popular in the green room. Aminatta Forna is somebody that many of you will know from, well, the jangling of the silver that goes along with her name, because right since the moment she picked up a pen to write her first novel, she was showered with accolades and awards. And I have to, Aminatta, you'll have to forgive me for this, I'm going to have to look at the list, because you've won so much. I just don't want to miss out the really important things. So first of all, there was The Devil That Danced on the Water. Now, most people have that tricky first step into the world of writing, not Aminatta, because what was an intimate memoir of the life of yourself and your father ended up capturing the imagination of not just a voracious readership, but also the judging panel of the Samuel Johnson Award, and that's no small thing. That was followed by Ancestor Stories, which won too many awards for me to mention right now, and then Memory of Love, which very significantly won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, was Best Book, and also was shortlisted for the Orange Book Prize. Now, I don't know how these things translate over here in India, but these are the Rolls Royces of awards in the literary circuit. So Aminatta has been lauded by the establishment and loved by those who pick up her books. And well, there's a reason for that. It's because she brings to the page a wealth of experience, and I might say actually even a pain that is kind of universal, because her story, like many of your stories, spans generations that have been defined by things like partition, things like betrayal, things like neighbours turning upon neighbours. And those are some of the themes that we're going to be discussing this afternoon. But also we are exceptionally lucky because this is one of the first outings of Aminatta's new book, The Hired Man. And I personally, I can't wait to hear, because I know that these things are rather delicious on the page, and even more delicious when you have the heart that beats behind them, presenting them to you. So, without further ado, would you please put your hands together in a very warm welcome for Aminatta Forna.
Thank you.
So shall we just start talking about you? Because I think you're fascinating, and your background is fascinating, and even though it may be from a different part of the world to most of the people in this hall today, I think there are resonances that they will understand. So just tell us a little bit about your parents and what made you you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Anita and everybody else who's here. It's delightful to be back in Jaipur again. I was here 4 years ago. Actually, last time I was here, I watched Barack Obama being inaugurated while I was waiting for my car to take me to the airport, and this time I watched him being re-inaugurated at Delhi Airport. And it reminded me that I have just one thing in common with Barack Obama, which is that we were both children of about the same circumstances. We were both born out of a particular time in history when our fathers came of age at the same time of their nations. So my father, his father, they were what were called by Wally Soyinka the Renaissance generation of Africa, these young men and women who came of age at the same time as their countries. And the job that they inherited, the destiny they inherited, was to lead those countries. In the wake of independence, or sorry, just in advance of independence, Britain decided rather belatedly that what they had to do was create some kind of middle class, some kind of professional class to lead these countries, to do all of the jobs. And so they gave out a lot of scholarships, as a sort of last sort of benign flare of colonialism. And they gave out a lot of scholarships, and my father went to Scotland. He met my mother, a young Scottish woman, and they married, had 3 children, and went back to Sierra Leone, where things had already begun to change. The country had become independent. I remember my mother telling me a story about my father when they were in Aberdeen when independence in Sierra Leone was declared, and all the African students went down to the British Council, which had given them scholarships and hosted a lot of their parties, welcome parties and things like that, and they'd hired the hall for subsequent successive independent parties, and he'd gone down, got a bit tipsy, and then on the bus home he lit 3 cigarettes and smoked them at the same time. And my mother had said to him, "But what are you doing, Mohammed? You don't even smoke." And he said to her, "I'm smoking the smoke of freedom, man. I'm smoking the smoke of freedom."
That sort of builds us to a picture where there should be a happily ever after, but there wasn't, was there?
The Renaissance, of course, never happened. I think we know now more, really. I get asked less often a question. I used to be asked a great deal when I first started writing about Sierra Leone by British people saying, "Oh, we left it all so well. How did it go wrong?" And I would marvel that they knew so little, really, of their own history, let alone mine. And I think we know now, because of the experience of Iraq and worries about Afghanistan, that really sticking a democracy on a place and walking away from it doesn't really guarantee anything. And of course, that's how, the African countries on the whole were not blessed with a middle class like India had. And of course, you had your ructions. But for us, what the consequence was, and I really came to see this after I'd written about it, that the small group of people who were in a position, who foresaw, who could stand up to the men with the dictatorship, the ambitions of dictatorship, who took over power, the very small group of people who could and did stand up were very easily annihilated. And my father was one of them. He was killed when I was 11 years old. He was probably the main opposition figure in Sierra Leone. He had actually joined the party and fought against the incumbent party, which wanted to introduce a one-party state. They had been elected, they had taken power, there were a series of coups, but eventually they were reinstated into their rightful place. And to the disappointment of all the men and women who had fought for the man who would become prime minister, he turned out to have exactly the same ambitions as the man they had just unseated. And my father had been in the government. He resigned in protest, set up an opposition party which was outlawed overnight. My stepmother and I and my brother and sister went into exile, well, hiding first, and then exile in Britain, and my father was in prison for 3 years. He was released, and we all went back to Sierra Leone, but I think he knew they were never going to let him live, actually. I really do. I think the way he conducted his life towards the end, he absolutely knew. People told him to leave the country, and he declined to do that. And in the end, he was arrested one day when I was at home on holiday. We saw him once in the next year, and he was killed in 1975.
Just hearing that sends chills, I think. But then, as an 11-year-old, to know that your father has been taken after having the sense that something was going drastically wrong, for many that would just be a white, blind panic of fear and rage, and yet it's a theme that you just keep going back to. You started with the memoir, and it seems to be, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems to be one of those, it seems to be a shadow that sits above everything that you've done since.
It's certainly, set off a train of thought that I haven't yet completed, but I didn't know until I wrote the memoir, until I wrote The Devil That Danced on the Water, quite how much my father had foreseen. So, of course, that was hindsight. I look back on it as an adult. I spoke to people who had known him, and several of them told me that they had warned him that he was a target. I mean, of course he was a target. He was the one person who had defied the Prime Minister so openly. He had published, when he resigned, he'd actually published a letter in the newspaper, and he had warned the IMF. I mean, this is one of the things that really grates with me. He'd actually warned the IMF what was happening to the country's money, that the president, well, the then Prime Minister, who then made himself president for life, was stealing it. So he really tried to do everything he could. He had foresight. And so I became very interested in this question of foresight. And he had, what happened was that he had, on the eve of his execution, he was hanged. On the eve of his execution, he and the other men who were supposed to die along with him were all given a paper and a pen, and they were told that they could write a plea to the president and ask him to spare their life. And I think my father certainly knew that the president would never spare his life, that what he'd do is use this as a, against him. So what he did instead was he wrote an account of his life and the country since independence. And there was a man who'd gone to the prison, a journalist, and he was supposed to witness the executions. And he actually knew my father, and he'd been a young supporter of his party. And so my father gave him the document, and this man hid it for 20 years. And it came out just at the end of the war. And the man died, and his widow found it and gave it to a newspaper. So we actually read it for the first time in a newspaper. And what was extraordinary about it, for me, and actually I'd been thinking of writing something about what had happened to us, but suddenly here the whole thing was in sharp relief, that here was somebody who, in 1975 had foreseen this war and had written, the last thing he wrote in this document was that the country would move to chaos and anarchy and war, that this would be the end of the rule of law if people allowed Stevens, the dictator, to carry on. So it was extraordinary that, when it was published, Anita, it came out at a time when the country was doing a whole lot of soul-searching, because we had had a terrible, terrible war. And so this question was being asked over and over again, how did this happen? We didn't think it could happen to us. So it came about at that time, and it also gave me the entire frame of reference for The Devil That Danced with the Water. And I guess I just never stopped asking that question. How much can we foresee? What are our individual responsibilities? And how do people behave under oppression and when war comes about?
To understand it, one has to almost keep picking at the scab, though, which must, I'm just guessing that it must be quite painful, because you don't have to just put yourself in the shoes of the person who loses their life heroically, but those who allowed it to happen, those who were complicit, those who were active, those who were silent, all of those levels you have to keep looking at, don't you?
Yes, I suppose it's a condition, because I'm actually quite a happy person. So, but I do deal with painful subjects, but I am actually rather a cheerful person. I think actually what happens is that the more you write about something, the more you realize that there are just millions of people like you out there, that actually, of course, globally, the condition of oppression is far more common than the condition of freedom. And so for every time that I sit on a stage like this telling people what it's like to live under oppression, well, you know enough about it in your own history, but when this happens in Britain, I kind of think we really should do this the other way round. We really should get somebody who's grown up in Oxford or Cheltenham all their lives, had 3 meals a day and gone to school, and put them on stage in Nigeria, Sudan, and Guatemala, so that they can tell people what it's like. So I guess it's a condition I've got used to, but I suppose people say don't write about, well, somebody once said, write about what you know, then somebody else, I can't remember the name of the person, said, don't write about what you know, write about what you want to understand. And I guess wanting to understand has become, a condition in itself.
Let's talk about the new book that we're going to hear about, because, as you say, for the first 3 works that you presented to the world, Sierra Leone was the heart of the matter. And yet you've now moved the action to Croatia, which is so different and yet so the same, isn't it?
So the same.
Tell us why it's so the same.
Well, I'll tell you where the idea came from. There's always, with every book I have, and I think it's the same for most authors, there's this kind of a spark of fire, and you get one idea. I mean, The Memory of Love, I remember quite distinctly, actually was all going to be set in Argentina, because an Argentinian friend told me about her father, who had been an academic, and how, growing up during the Dirty War, she and her sisters had had to ask themselves more and more questions about him, what he was doing and what he was not doing. And there'd been a moment when a boy that she had had a crush on at school had been disappeared along with his entire family. And she realized that her father probably knew that was going to happen. And he gave me the idea for the character of Elias Cole, who is the central character in The Memory of Love. So actually, ideas don't always begin in the country that you then write about. Of course, I went back to Sierra Leone. I was researching The Devil That Danced on the Water, and I came across men like her father all the time, excusing, and yet who somehow had managed to rise in their careers, despite claiming that they hadn't been part of it. So that's where The Memory of Love actually started in Argentina and moved to Sierra Leone. The Hired Man started in Sierra Leone, where I came across more and more stories of betrayal during the Civil War. I mean, we know about France and denunciations, and there were these stories of very intimate betrayals in Sierra Leone. And I began to think along that idea of kind of honing it down to what actually happens when the gloves are off, you know. People I had known reasonably well had done some really terrible things. And I remember telling a war reporter that one of my cousins had committed atrocities. And he was so shocked. And I said, but this is what happens, you know. If it's a civil war, the person right next to you is likely to have done something, and those people are all related to somebody. And I had gone to a party with some friends who came from the former Yugoslavia. And actually, it was just before Christmas, and you know, we were drinking and celebrating, but I had brought a couple of friends from Sierra Leone with me, and we all started talking about war, and we all started talking about this very thing of the people you thought you knew and what they did in war. And they were Bosnian and Croatian, the people in the house, and they had friends, school friends, who had committed terrible atrocities against Muslims in Bosnia. And the British people at the party didn't understand it. They had a completely different experience of war. War for them was something that men went away and fought, and then those men might come back broken, but that was their experience of war. It was through the soldiers and through the stories or the silences of the soldiers going and coming. But the idea that it was fought on your soil and that people you knew you would be fighting on the opposite side of, that was completely, it was clearly very hard for them to understand, very hard for them to understand. I mean, I think about this because the man who was sort of given, I mean, I say sort of, because these things are kind of understandings. The president wanted my father dead. He put one of his ministers in charge of it. That man died some years ago, but his daughter is my age. And when I'm in Sierra Leone, I regularly find myself in the same company as her. You know, I may go to certainly a restaurant. I know once or twice we've been invited to the same party. I decline. I don't wish to be in a room with her. She didn't do it, but I find the whole thing too difficult and painful. And that's how close it is. That's really how close it is. We have very good friends in common. So, you know, I really wanted to look at that idea of personal betrayal and where it begins, really, because I think nothing comes from nothing. You know, very often a lot of betrayals that happen in civil war are actually personal grudges, fallings out that become played out in a much more terrible way.
It was an interesting thing. We were talking about it, so this is kind of a continuation of the chat we were having back in the Authors' Lounge. But the difficulty that a British audience would have with that concept, I don't think you Indian authors would have. I mean, just as this, it probably would be more useful in Punjab, but hands up those of you whose families were affected by partition, for example. So that is a similar experience, Aminatta, I think, you know, where neighbours turned on each other overnight, who had lived hand in pocket for generations, and suddenly, if you were a Muslim living in a Sikh area, you had to flee for your lives because you were the enemy, and it happened the other way around. So I think this audience probably has a much more instant understanding of what you're talking about.
Yes, I mean, our war in Sierra Leone, and that, I guess, is the difference with us and the former Yugoslavia, which is why we've sort of managed to recover socially from it much better, is that it didn't go along ethnic lines. But the similarities are neighbour on neighbour. You know, some people joined the rebel movement, some people didn't. And what I found quite fascinating about writing actually all my books, but I guess in particular The Memory of Love, well, actually, the Devil That Danced on the Water, ancestor stones, at first, to me, unaccountably, did incredibly well in Spain. And then when I went to Spain and I started to give talks, I realized we were talking about civil war, and Spain had had this 50-year silence because of Franco. So they'd skipped a generation, and they are really only just beginning to talk about it. And last year I went to the Gaul Festival. There was a little controversy around it.
In Sri Lanka, yeah.
In Sri Lanka. There was a little controversy around it. Some people had suggested that the writers boycott it because of the oppression in Sri Lanka. And I thought, no, this is exactly why we go. This is exactly what writers do. And I gave 3 talks to rooms of, 600, 800, 1,000 people. We were all talking about Sri Lanka. We were using the words Sierra Leone, but we were all talking about Sri Lanka. So those experiences resonate over and over again, regardless of where you are, even if it's geographically, linguistically different. Even people of different colour, they're the same experiences.
So just, for some of the very young members of the audience, the backdrop for your latest book is the breakup, the fragmentation of the former Yugoslavia, which was the dream of one man, Marshal Tito, who wanted to bind together disparate people and disparate parts of a nation and make them a political whole. And when he died, the whole thing kind of went to hell, and neighbours, as you say, turned on neighbours. It went along ethnic lines, but it was also grudges. Somebody had somebody's wheelbarrow, and so they settled scores by shooting their family. Could you introduce us to the main character and tell us a little bit about him, because that's always such a lovely way into a landscape. So who is the protagonist of your latest book?
The main character of The Hard Man is Duro. He is in his 40s, early 40s. He lives in a small town called Gosht, and he has been there all his life, apart from a period of a few years when he left. He never leaves Gosht. His family have left, other people have left. Duro has his own reasons for staying on. He is a hunter. He hunts deer. He lives with his 2 dogs. A very quiet, very solitary life. He is the narrator of the book, and the story that he tells is the story of a woman called Laura, a British woman, and her 2 teenage children. And they buy a house in the village, and they come for a summer holiday. And Duro is the person that they meet. He's a handyman. They're doing what a lot of British people do. Maybe you're not familiar with this, but buying houses abroad and doing them up is a favourite occupation of the British middle classes. And Croatia has become a destination that's very popular. And I guess when I saw as I said, there's this spark of, the spark of an idea, the spark of fire. So I had this idea about betrayal and what I'd seen and knew about Argentina, Sierra Leone. I had that idea about maybe writing about a very small betrayal that takes place with massive consequences. And then I came across an advert in a British newspaper offering holiday homes for sale in Croatia. And people were running out to buy them in great numbers. And I spoke to a friend of mine who'd reported from Croatia in the war, and I said, my goodness, don't they know? And we had a discussion about whether it was cynicism or naivety that was making this happen, because to me, to go and buy a house, an empty house in a country which had known ethnic cleansing, was an extraordinary thing to do. Would you not ask? Would you not ask, why is this house empty? And so that gave me the idea of taking the British family in it, because I wanted to think about compare the differences of people who grew up with a long history of oppression and people who really haven't had at any time in the recent future in their families an understanding of it.
Will you read us a little bit through Duro's eyes? That would be lovely. I think we'd all like that very much. This is the hard bit. This is when you ask an author to pick her favourite child.
No, I'm just looking for where I turn my page down, and it's got lost. Don't worry. Did you say that? Oh, good for you. Oh, no, I don't want to read that one anymore, though. I've changed my mind. Hold on. Bear with me. Talk among yourselves. Here we go. Am I going to do 2 readings or 1?
I think 2 would be lovely.
Oh,
Why
actually,
don't
all
we
right
do
then,
this
I'll
one
do
first?
the one we
Okay,
suggested first.
fine.
Okay, here we go.
We'll do one.
Duro the Hunter. At sundown, I walked the dogs on the hills. The lights of Gosh separated me from a vast darkness, the sea, 2 hours' drive away. Zeka picked up a scent and ran ahead with her nose to the ground, Cos behind. I left them for a short while to see where they were headed, and then called them to heel before they could disappear into the pine plantation. Together we entered the trees. Inside it was closer to night. The pine needles were soft underfoot, soundless. There's a place where the deer gather on the other side of the plantation, and the trees give way to a clearing. At about 50 meters from our destination, I told the dogs to go down and wait for me, which they did, sinking slowly to their haunches. They liked to pretend they didn't care, Cos and Zeka, but under the skin, every nerve and muscle twitched. I moved slowly forward, balancing my weight on the outside edges of my feet. Every 10 steps, I stopped and listened. In the silence of the forest, I counted on hearing the deer before I saw them, and so it happened. A group of 8 grazing at the edge of the clearing. A young doe lifted her head at my approach. I froze. She glanced about nervously before she lowered her head again. 7 does, 2 bucks. The bucks were younger, less than a year old, probably. The doe who'd raised her head was closest to me and perhaps 3 years old. I lifted my rifle, set my sights on her, and released the safety catch. She grazed on, her body angled away from me. I watched and waited. She might have sensed me, for she lifted her head a second time and looked to left and right, and then in my direction. An ear twitched. Neither of us moved. Then she relaxed and lowered her head. Reaching for another morsel, she shifted her footing and presented her broadside to me. I placed the crosshair at her temple, took a breath, exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and watched her drop.
And Duro, who has, and that's beautiful, thank you very much for reading that, but Duro, who has this almost innocent pastoral and yet is armed background, he transforms, doesn't he, from being a hunter into somebody who fires bullets at
Well, one of the
much more
things I
important
discovered
things.
about, I mean, I think war uses the weapons at hand. And, you know, Sierra Leone was a low-tech war. And people mainly used the weapons of cutlasses, axes. They used farming weapons. And that was why the war was characterized the way it was, with amputations and, you know, and of course a rebel army in a third world country doesn't have access on much, you know, automatic weaponry. But the thing about the former Yugoslavia was that all the men were hunters. It was a hunting nation. And so when, you know, when the war started and there was a sort of general call to arms, not only were there a lot of arms available, there were a lot of men who knew how to use them, and therefore that gave rise to the particular tactic that characterized the war in the former Yugoslavia, which was sniping. And so Duro, the hunter, turns into Duro, the sniper.
There's a very peculiar thing. I mean, I made a documentary in Mostar and in Zagreb a few years after, and seeing somebody going through a yearbook from their school and saying, yeah, she's dead, he killed her, he's dead, he died because of that family. And it is almost unthinkable. I mean, it's unthinkable to me, but possibly not to others whose memories of partition, and again, friends and family doing that kind of thing. Our grandparents, I know my grandparents have told me these stories, but the closeness of the betrayal was extraordinary, wasn't it?
I think in the former Yugoslavia it was even closer than in Sierra Leone. You know, in Sierra Leone generally there was a sort of rebel army that swept through, and some people joined it, and some people used the opportunity to point the finger at people that they had, you know, maybe accused them of collaborating. You had to be very careful at the end of the war, I remember. You know, for example, The Devil That Danced on the Water came out at the very end of the war, and that was kind of unusual, actually, for a book that said so much about the antecedents to the war to be published quite so quickly, but it just happened that way. And in the book, I named absolutely everybody that had ever done anything. You know, I mean, I used all the real names, but the only name I changed was actually the man who had committed the biggest betrayal. He had been paid to lie at my father's trial and to say that he'd seen my father in a particular place that would make him part of the conspiracy. And it was a lie, and the man admitted to me that he'd been paid to do it. But he wasn't a nice person, you know, he didn't really see, he was a totally amoral person who didn't see the consequences, or chose not to see the consequences of what he had done. And I disliked him greatly, greatly. But his was the only name I changed in the whole book, because he was a poor man, and he sold lotto tickets on the street. And the atmosphere at the end of the war in Sierra Leone was such that I thought he would be lynched. You know, I thought that if ordinary people read the name, put two and two together, knew who he was, and we're a tiny country, we have 4 million people, and the city is pretty small, so, you know, it's not very hard to find somebody. I had found him in the chaotic aftermath of the war, and I felt pretty certain that he could be lynched or necklaced, and that I wasn't going to let that happen. With the former Yugoslavia, what you really see when you go there, and everybody who experienced the war, who reported the war, said, I mean, you go to a town, as I did, I looked along this whole belt, the Krajina, which became the Republic of partly Serbian, it was called the Republic of Serbia Krajina, and tried to become independent from Croatia. I mean, when you go to the towns and it's still like that, you absolutely see the houses that were targeted and blown out, and they were the houses of the Serbs. When the revenge against the Serbs came, that's how it went. So theirs, I mean, we did have this rebel army, there were these denunciations and accusations, but, you know, what happened in the former Yugoslavia had a different flavor about it, which was the absolute targeting of certain people and households.
The second reading that you're going to do, I'm going to ask you to do, is utterly beautiful and poignant, and it's about loss. It's about that sense of those who are no longer with us. Just before we get to that reading, though, just in all of the work, your whole body of work, have you come to the conclusion that only bad people do bad things, or good people can do unspeakably bad things?
Actually, I'll say something quite heartwarming, I think, because I used to be a journalist, you know. I used to be at the BBC. And I guess this is the thing about if you've known oppression and if you haven't known oppression, is that there'd always be this journalist sort of easy, sort of cliched response, which is none of us know what we're going to do, you know, if we haven't experienced it. And one of the things I think is, first of all, literature can help us work out what kind of person we are. Right? If you haven't experienced it, you know, one of the reasons I write is to give that experience. And so you can try and work out what kind of person you are. The second thing is that, you know, I met three things. The second thing is I met a couple who'd done a wonderful thing, and they had hidden me when I was a child for 3 weeks in Sierra Leone when my father had been imprisoned, and there were rumors that the president and his henchmen were trying to find my father's children. And these people had hidden us for 3 weeks, and they didn't even know us very well, and they'd got us out of the country, and we'd eventually got to Britain. And I went back and I found them, and I asked them why they had done this, and the only thing the woman had said to me, the only thing she said was, well, I couldn't live with myself if I'd done anything else. And at first I thought it was an insubstantial answer, and then the more I read, the more I thought, the more I wrote, the more I talked to people, I realized that what she said was absolutely true. You know, there are those who can live with themselves and those who can't. And when I look back on the war in Sierra Leone, and I've had this response from my friends in Croatia and Bosnia, you know, there are some people whose personality you don't know well enough, whose character, rather, you don't know well enough, and maybe they do something terrible and you're surprised by it. But if it is somebody whose character you know, there aren't that many surprises, actually. You know, my cousin, who was a soldier who switched to the rebel army, who did these terrible things, who burned people in their homes and orchestrated atrocities, he was a horrible person. You know, he was always a horrible, vengeful person. So I guess that was really what came into the idea of the hired man is, you know, is it, you know, who is it in your group? If you look at the people you know now, hopefully not your friends, hopefully you choose your friends a bit more carefully, maybe you don't, but if you look at people you know now, sometimes it's quite interesting to think, who might it be? And that's the idea behind the hired man.
So tell us a little bit of the background of the next passage that you're going to read to us?
Well, this is, Duro is in his home. Laura has arrived with her teenagers. They've taken over the house. Duro has presented himself. He lives very nearby. He's the closest neighbour and a handyman. And he has presented himself to work on the house. He needs the work. There's not that much work in that part of the country. But he also has the reasons of his own to be there. This is an evening after a day's work on the house. They had cleared out one of the outbuildings. In the evening, I fried sausages, peeled and boiled potatoes, and chopped some chard, which I'd pulled from the neglected vegetable beds at the Blue House. I poured a glass of wine and carried my plate of food into the main room, where I set it on the table. I fetched the bag of mail I had taken from the outbuildings and began to sift through the contents as I ate. Utility bills. I opened one at random. A demand for payment of several hundred dinara for electricity and a warning of the consequences of non-payment. The next bill, dated a few months later, had been adjusted by the addition of several noughts. There was a time inflation ran wild. I opened another bill, for gas this time, terminating supplies. A letter from the publisher of the car magazine regretted the non-renewal of the subscription. Several copies of the same magazine still inside their plastic folders. There were no letters or postcards, no envelopes full of old photographs, not even a shopping list or an old checkbook bristling with scribbled stubs. No note left for the plumber, no scrap of paper bearing a scrawled address, directions. There was nothing except official letters and circulars. It was as though somebody had been through all of it before me and removed anything personal. I stuffed everything back into the bag and slung it aside. I thought, is this all that remains? When I look back to that night, I see that the idea for writing this seeded then. Would I take it all with me? Who would tell my story? So many people have left Gosht. Not like the old days when they stayed away for a few years and came back wearing Italian clothes and carting German fridges. Now they never came back. Now of the old crowd, there are just 3 of us left. Kreshimir, Fabian, and me. Laura arrived and took over the Blue House, and things began to change. In a very short time, it seemed, certain people forgot what had been agreed for so long, or perhaps they thought it no longer applied, or no longer applied to them, that the pact we had held on to for 16 years was somehow over. Some days I wondered what would happen to my own house when I was gone. I've lived here for 18 years, and maybe with luck, I'll live twice as long again. More than likely, I shall die alone, as I live now, and as I have no executor or person or persons will be appointed to come and deal with my estate, sort my belongings into piles to sell and throw. They will sort through my papers, and when they do, they will find this. Maybe that person is you. Or at least I have to tell this story, and I must tell it to somebody, so it may as well be you come to sort through my belongings. You were young, and you don't know or don't remember the things that happened. Nobody seems to remember, even those who were old enough, those who were there. But I remember it, every grinding minute, hour, and day, how things unfolded. Our story doesn't show us in a very good light. I wish it were different, but there it is. This story is not the story of the whole of the past, just the story of a single summer. As I said, somebody must stand guard over the past. In Gosht, that somebody is me, the only person I can trust.
I know it's awful to sort of say, look, psychoanalyze yourself, but in a way, are you sort of a custodian of the past, sort of making sure that by telling these stories and by putting them down, that you're sort of
me alone, actually. I mean, no, but I think that after a war, one a civil war in particular, there's this kind of collective amnesia. I mean, but it's the same with South Africa. You know, could you find a single pro-apartheid white South African after Mandela was released? No. You know, this collective amnesia and denial comes over. So I wouldn't say that it's me, but I do think it's what writers do. I think it's also what journalists do, actually, but they tend to do it in the moment, and writers tend to do it as an ongoing process, maybe some years afterwards, maybe some decades afterwards, but yes.
There's also, I mean, you said sort of people can be inherently bad or inherently decent, and I mean, I don't know whether you came across.
I don't know if it's inherent, but there aren't that many surprises.
Leaning towards, and you can, yes, it doesn't shock you. But I don't know whether you came across this in Croatia, but certainly with partition, there are families who, even though they, as you say, they came across a vacant house, they just didn't ask, why is this house vacant? Why are there still toys in the nursery? They moved their children into the nursery. But some families kept hold of all the letters, waiting for somebody to come back. And now I know, you know, decades later, people are going back to their old houses, and only some houses have said, look, I think this box belongs to you, which is really quite a
Oh, that's
thing.
interesting. Yeah, that's happening in the former Yugoslavia. There are people returning, not so much, because of course the timeline is shorter, but people returning, and that's one of the ideas I played with in The Hired Man. I was in Denmark recently, and I told this story to a journalist. Well, I told her the plot of the book. I mean, I think in the former Yugoslavia, as far as I know, people have gone back, but not so much to reclaim their houses, because of course the depth of the ethnic cleansing was such that actually living among those people is not really an option. But she did tell me, and it was extraordinary how it mirrored the fictional idea how I had that life was imitating art, that there had been this huge row among the Danish football team because a Danish, an ethnically Danish person, had bought a holiday home in Bosnia, and one of the ethnically Bosnian Danish footballers had been furious about it and said, that could have been my house. That could have been my house. And so there it had actually played out in real life in Denmark.
Do you now have some kind of rule book, if you like, of levels of complicity and levels of guilt? You know, I mean, you talked really interestingly that you wouldn't go to dinner with the daughter, was it, of the man who had been given the order to kill your father, the minister, but you did chat to the man who lied and whose lie directly led to the death of your father. So where are you? I mean, is there a strata of guilt and blame?
Well, I mean, I don't go to dinner with her simply because I find it so very difficult. You know, it's a painful thing, and I just don't want to be reminded of it while I'm trying to enjoy myself at a party. It isn't because I think that she was complicit. She was a child like I was. I mean, but certainly the thing that rubs with her is, you know, she doesn't, and I know this from people who know her very well, question where the money that paid for her large apartment in Maida Vale came from. You know, and apparently she, you know, thinks of her father as a wonderful man, as a hero. She's certainly not interrogated any of his actions, which are now pretty well known. So I'm guessing that I wouldn't like her. But, I don't, she was a child. She certainly wasn't part of it. Of course, the man who did what he did, well, you know, I mean, I had a purpose in talking to him. But, I mean, I guess I feel that really, unless you do something, you are part of it. You know, I mean, I'm afraid silence is complicity. A friend of mine is a human rights lawyer in Sierra Leone, and I had to talk to somebody, her mother and her father, who were at the university. And this is when I was researching for The Devil That Danced on the Water. And I didn't know her then. She was just a young woman sitting in the corner of the room. And I was asking her mother and her father, what did the academics do? What did the intellectuals do after the first arrest, the arrest of my father and some of the other outspoken dissidents? And these two people, you know, went all around the subject. And I was very used to this, not just as a journalist, but also in my particular role in finding out my own story. And I could see that she was listening at the table. And after 10 minutes of listening to her parents not give an answer about what they did, she suddenly lost her temper. And she leaned across to her father and she shouted at him and she said, "She's asking you what you did." And the years went by and we became very good friends, she and I. I stay with her in Sierra Leone and I stay with her, she stays with me in London. And I know that this has been a source of great shame to her for a very long time, that she has not stopped thinking about what her father didn't do. And, you know, a lot of what I observed with her went into the memory of love, about how you know, if it's hard to live with a father who died for something, I think it's probably harder to live with a father who didn't do anything. And she came to me one day and she said, well, I asked my father why he hadn't stood up to what was going on. And my father, her father, had said to her, well, I would have, but I had 5 children, so I couldn't. And I had to say to her, oh, but my father would have given the very same answer. I had 3 children, so I had to.
I think that's a really good place to actually open up the floor to questions, and I see that our friends in the green tabards are around. So if you put your hand up, and I will get a mic to you, and if you could stand up, that would be really lovely. Thank you very much.
In the Africa panel yesterday, one of the themes was about having the right to tell a certain story. And of course, a writer can write anything. I'm wondering how your process went with researching this new novel. Obviously, there's a lot of emotional authenticity in your own experience in this new place, but I'm just wondering how it was moving into that environment, developing that story, those characters.
Well, when I write about Sierra Leone, I feel obliged to tell a bigger story, simply because most readers don't know anything about it. So I feel obliged to put far more framework around it. One of the pleasures of writing The Hired Man was not having to do that, certainly for British and Western readers, because the war in the former Yugoslavia had been fairly well reported and people were pretty familiar with it. So I didn't have to do so much of that. I honed the whole thing right down. In Ancestor Stones and The Memory of Love, there's sort of a fairly big cast of characters, and I'm telling a much wider story, the story of the entire country. Croatia has its own writers who've done that, you know, but with The Hired Man, I honed it down really just to the character of Duro and the people directly either side of him. And then I had a couple of friends of mine, the people I've talked about, who shared their memories of the 1970s, because it's set either side, very much like Memory of Love is, it's set either side of the conflict, before and after. And so they shared their memories of the 1970s with me and their experience of war, which, as I said, was many times strikingly similar, but they provided me with the detail. And then one of them read it afterwards. I was quite nervous, actually, when I gave it to them to read. And I gave it to one of them to read afterwards, and when we met, he were actually going through the detail, you know, if I'd made any factual errors and things like that. But when he gave it to me, gave me the manuscript back, he just said, this book says everything I've ever wanted to say about Croatia. So I think between our shared experiences and his help with it, you know, hopefully it's come to something.
There's a lady here in the second row, and then you could get the mic to the gentleman in the middle, and he could just be ready for the next question. Thank you.
So just a quick thank you to you for the honesty you bring to whatever you've been saying through the last couple of days. But my question really is, in the telling of your story and your father's story, you said you've not changed names and you've kept them as it is, except for that one person, of course. But do authors have a responsibility, do authors have a responsibility, and if yes, what kind of a responsibility do they have to the children of these people who, like your friend, for instance, she hasn't done a crime, or she hasn't...
My not friend, yeah.
She hasn't really done, sorry, the person that you know, she hasn't done anything per se. She was a child and a victim of probably what her father did and circumstances. So do the authors who write about these circumstances have a responsibility towards protecting that in some way, and not making them responsible or guilty for what their parents did? And this is not unique to your perspective alone, of course. I mean, for example, the Germans and so many children of...
When I wrote The Devil That Danced on the Water, I felt I had absolutely no responsibility to anybody but the country to tell the narrative that had been untold. That was the first thing. And to my father, I think, to tell his story, for which he'd given so much. The only other person, apart from the man who I worried might be lynched, The only other person I was concerned about was my stepmother, because she still lived in the country and there were issues of security. She'd had a very difficult life. You know, she'd lived under the regime that had killed her husband all this time. She was a stayer. On the panel today, we talked about people who go and people who stay, and my stepmother's incredible act of courage has been never to leave, you know, despite everything that happened to us. And she had so many chances to leave, she stayed. But I was concerned for her because she had issues of security. So I actually gave her the text, and I thought to myself, right, well, I won't offer to change anything, but if she asks me to, I will. Right. And so I gave her the text, and she was staying with my sister in London, and she kept reading it. I kept ringing my sister and saying, what's she doing now? My sister said, oh, she came out to have some lunch, she's gone back into her room and she's reading the book. And I was very nervous, and when my mother handed me the book back, all she'd done was put a big tick at the end and said, well done, darling. So no, I didn't feel obliged to anybody, unless there were issues of you know, life and death. I didn't feel obliged to anybody, and I really felt that my obligation was to offer another narrative. You know, we had had the single story for years. The government, for example, that woman that her father belonged to, had done everything to wipe out all the other narratives. And I felt, as a writer, as a daughter, as a person, that offering alternative narratives was the responsibility I had.
The gentleman in the middle, yes, if you could you stand up, please? That's much easier then. Thank you.
Good evening. I really liked your reading, which you did.
Thank you.
I'm also relating this to a session we had in Kashmir yesterday, where we had a Kashmiri Pandit who went through the same situation. You talked to the partition people, but there's something which is ongoing right now. And he started off by saying, quoting from Naipaul, V.S. Naipaul, he says, the world is as it is. Okay. And you can't do much about it. You have seen the best of, my question to you have seen the best of human nature. You've seen the worst of it. Is there hope? Will your next book be more positive?
It's a lovely question. It's one that I've wanted to ask. Yeah.
Is there hope?
Is there hope? I mean,
well,
on the balance of things, if this shit keeps happening, in summary, you know, is there much hope that actually we could break out of this cycle?
I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think there was hope. You know, I trained as a lawyer originally. I probably would have become a shipping lawyer and made a shed load of money. You know, if I didn't think there was hope, I wouldn't be spending my life describing and interrogating all of these situations. So yes, I do, and I think there are some parts of the world where things are palpably getting better because a society has decided to make it so. You know, so everything I do and everything I write is really trying to reach out to individual readers to become those people that will make a society better. So yes, I mean, I think obviously bad things are always going to continue to happen. That's extremely unlikely that war will go away. But I think generally there are societies where things work. There are a growing number of societies where things work. There are fewer wars in Africa, half the number of wars than there were 10 years ago. So yes, I think things change. Things can change.
Do we have any? Yes, okay, there's the gentleman there. Was there anybody at the front that I've just been dazed and confused about? Yes, if you take the mic, please. Thanks.
Hi. I just want to explore the theme that gentleman sort of stoked a little further in terms of your writing, and maybe a little personal, the question. As an author, conflict seems to be an area of interest for you, for sure. But do you aspire to write something diametrically opposite just as a storyteller? And do you think has this become your genre? And do you want to break out of it? And if you do, you know, what do you think you'll need to do to exercise this out of your system?
I wrote a book about a dog once. And nobody wanted to publish it. So at the end of The Memory of Love, I was so tired. It took me 3 years. I was so tired. And at the end of every book, and I was like completely, I had to go and get all kinds of physiotherapy, because when you're writing and you think you see the summit, You keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. You think, oh, I'm nearly there, nearly there, nearly there. And then I get more and more and more tense, more and more hunched, and then the summit keeps disappearing. There's always a false summit. And then suddenly the book is over. And so I had to go and have all the knots straightened out. And I said to my husband, right, that is it. I'm never writing another book. And he just said, oh, you say that every time. And okay, I said, well, like not for a year anyway. And that was Monday. Thursday, I began a new book. But I wrote a book about a dog, and it was a kid's book, and it was just a pleasure to write. I wrote a book about a dog, an angel who came to Earth as a street dog in Mexico. Probably not my greatest work. I give it to my son as a bedtime story for him. But, so, I mean, I do write for pleasure sometimes. But I think the writing really that maybe one day I'll get this out of my system. It doesn't seem to be going very quickly. I had an idea for a book recently, and I guess it plays with a lot of the same themes. It's not actually set in conflict, but it's taking another idea. Is that going to not jinx this? Because that can happen. But
Oh, give us a clue. We won't tell anyone.
Yeah, don't tell anyone. It's taking this is going to be podcast or YouTubed.
I don't know.
Anyway, don't worry. I mean, it was one of the questions I get asked a lot in audiences. If you look at the 1960s and the generation who were my parents, and their great shame, certainly in Sierra Leone, is not standing up to a particular oppression, I often get asked, what is the shame of our generation? What are we going to feel ashamed about in 30 years' time? What are our children who become environmental lawyers or human rights lawyers or whatever going to turn around to us and say, what did you do? And I often think about that. What's going to be the great shame of our generation? So even though I'm not going back to conflict, it's actually the idea of responsibility that, and foresight, prescience, that I find myself returning to. So I guess some themes just never go away.
I think we have time for one more question, and that lady there has caught my eye, so if you could pass the mic over, that'd be lovely. Thank you.
Yes, as one of those 60 generations, I happen to be in Nigeria and working in what became Biafra. And when you're speaking, and we always think it's the others who are complicit. And the question that it raises for me is, to what extent was I complicit? Could I have said and done more? And so far, you've been talking really about the men and their complicity. And it's about the father of your friend at the university. What did he do? Is there an issue for the part women play and the part of women in standing up to telling the truth at such times, in challenging?
Well, that brings me on to my other novel, Ancestor Stones, which yes, there is. So The Devil That Danced in the Water was really about the macro politics, the big players who, in the 1960s, were men. But I think women do have a role to play, I've always sort of been amazed by women who are married to bad men, actually, how they did it. And sometimes people say to me, oh, it's love. And I go, what? Don't give me that. You have to be part of this if you can marry this person and sleep next to him every night without asking a question. So you must in some way be like him. But actually, in Ancestor Stones, I really wrote about the experience of women at a very different level. These were rural women who lived in a rural town in Sierra Leone, four of them who were all sisters, but had a very different experience of war. And one of the things that was quite fascinating in the war in Sierra Leone, two things that women did, really, I'll tell you them anecdotally briefly because they exemplify. I think actually Sierra Leonean women were on the whole, they certainly played their parts, both in the rebel army and the RUF. There were women fighters, but also as people who opposed it. And two of the things that happened, before the fighting started, there was a vote in 1996, and the army was in charge in Sierra Leone, and they had agreed to a democratic election simply because otherwise the aid supply would be cut off. And they'd agreed to it, but they didn't want it to happen. So on the morning of the elections, there was a lot of gunfire. The soldiers were out on the streets. Everybody was being frightened away from the ballot boxes. And my mother was one of the people calling in the election. And she and all the women, and it was mostly women who were the ones, you know, standing over the ballot boxes, she and all the women walked out of their houses and they formed human trains. And my stepfather actually said to me, well, her second husband said to me, I told her not to go. He said, I wasn't going to go out, I was terrified. But Sierra Leone is what's called has been called a matriarchy posing as a patriarchy. And I think there was an understanding that the one group of people who could face off the soldiers were the older women, because the soldiers were all younger men. And the one group of people who they wouldn't dare defy were women of a certain age. And so it was them who went out and faced the soldiers, faced the guns, faced the gunfire, and brought in the vote. And the other incident I will tell you about is, you know, when the war started proper, when the fighting started proper, it was the women's civil society movements who appealed to other women. And actually, rather like we talked about the empty houses in Croatia and Bosnia, they said, ask your son where that gold necklace came from. Ask your son, your husband, your lover, you know, ask him where that dress came from, the money came from, the jewelry he's giving you, because it was all looted. These were military, sometimes rebel forces going into towns, looting, burning, and then going back home with gifts for their girlfriends and their mothers. And for a while, I mean, ultimately the effect, I'm afraid, was lost because the war simply swept through, too much else was happening. But for a while there were these symbolic bonfires where women would take all of these things out of their houses and set fire to them in the streets and, you know, in that way try to bring about the violence. So women have played their part in Sierra Leone.
Aminatta, it's been fascinating, it's been emotional, and it's been just lovely, and thank you very much indeed. Aminatta's books are available in the bookshop, and I would urge you to buy all of them. And please do go if you'd like to and get them signed, because Aminatta's going to be signing books. She'll be led off by one of our friends here, and she'll be very happy to sign them and maybe continue the chat. But for now, can we please put our hands together and thank Aminatta Forna.
Thank you.